Hello friends, welcome back to the next session on operations planning, scheduling and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, we'll be able to understand and deal with the concept of MTS scenarios. The learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, you will be able to understand what do we mean by MTS, what are the various functions that have been performed under MTS, and what are the various activities or prerequisites for an effective implementation of MTS. Now let's begin with our learning. What do we mean by MTS? MTS is the concept of make to stock planning. That is, it defines about how do you plan the stocking activity or how do you plan the inventory or resource activities in the organization. The MTS strategy is an interface or a link between the sales and the production department. So in this case, we have to understand how the strategy or make to stock planning can be implemented between the selling department and between the production department. For in this case, one has to understand about what is the need and demand for a particular product into the market, and based on those particular demand, what amount needs to be supplied. The communication is been essentially required. So as we have seen that the communication or the interface between the sales and production department is been implemented with respect to the make to stock planning, and hence communication is essentially required. So effective communication leads to effective planning and effective implementation. The matching of demand and supply factors is essentially required, and only then the MTS as a part of a scenario, that is make to stock planning, can be implemented in a very effective way. The MTS scenario focuses on what goods are to be manufactured, how it has to be manufactured, and when it has to be delivered. All those concepts are dealing with ATO and MTO, but MTO focuses on what quantity of goods and services are needed to be required and needed to be manufactured, and when it has to be supplied to the market. So hence the coordination or communication between the sales and the production department is essentially required, and based on the availability of the number of customers into the market, the production department has to take the decision of producing. Time matching principle is essentially observed. So here in this case, it is to be seen that the time matching principle with respect to the availability of goods or delivery of goods of services within the specified time period is essentially needed to be seen, and then accordingly the goods are needed to be delivered. Now let's understand what does MTS provides. It provides for a certain sum which can predict what will happen in the near future. So make to order or make to supply strategy focuses on the concept of what can happen in a near future with respect to either the demand will increase or the demand will decrease, whether there will be a need for a product or whether there will not be a need for a product. If there is a need for a product, how many quantity or quality of product will be demanded, and so on. So prediction of future is essentially needed, and it can happen with respect to the scenario. Make to stock strategy preparation. Based on the MTO concept that has been applied, one can prepare a proper strategy with respect to how stocking or warehousing or inventory of those goods and services is been required or it can be implemented. And hence, the strategy implementation or the design of strategy can be easily undertaken with respect to the MTS as a strategy. Acceptance of customer during the long delivery times. So when there are large number of delivery times for a certain product, then in this particular case, we can understand or we can identify what is the patience level of a particular consumer. The patience level may either increase, may either decrease, and accordingly, based on those particular concern, we have to come to a conclusion about how do we test the availability of goods and services into the market, and when, in what way the goods and services can be provided as per the need and requirement of the consumers. Make some of your product to stock. So accordingly, what stocking or inventory or storage facilities or strategies is needed to be required. Based on the coordination or communication between the sales and the production department, one can easily come to a conclusion or to understanding about what quantity of goods and services will be demanded into a market. And when those particular goods and services are identified or they have been ascertained, we can come to a conclusion about what should be the storage capacity and what amount of goods and services are needed to be stored. Production with actual requirement. And hence, When there is a communication or coordination between the sales and the production department, they can easily come to a conclusion about what is the actual production requirement, how many goods are needed to be manufactured, where it has to be manufactured, how much is to be manufactured, and where it has to be stored or it has to be stocked. All those decisions have been undertaken in an effective way with the implementation of MTS as a strategy. Sales order is not as much important. So here in this case, the order that is being placed is not essentially important, but what order is been coming from the consumers, what is the demand level, all those factors are needed to be seen in an effective way on a prior basis. Incoming sales order using the existing inventory. So availability of inventory along with the production department, along with the stores department, and based on that particular inventory, what amount of goods and services can be manufactured or can be produced can be easily identified or can be controlled with respect to the MTS as a strategy. Now let's look at the components or the participants in the MTS as a part of a business. The various components of the participants of the MTS business strategy is the modularization, the configuration, the lean improvements, the incremental product development, and lastly, the new product development. So these are the various participants for the standardized implementation of an MTS business. Now let's understand why there is a disconnect between the sales and production and the MTS as a particular strategy. The customer lead time always needs to be measured. At several stages, it has been observed that the lead time for a consumer or a customer is not been measured or is not been calculated. So for the effective implementation of a particular strategy, in order to see that the product that is being demanded by a consumer or a customer is being delivered within a specified time period, the MTS as a part of a strategy is essentially required. Availability of check at all the interval, right from the manufacturing to the supply to the distribution to the finished goods to the reaching of the customer finished goods to the consumer, that is the end user, a proper check or intervals is essentially required. And when the product passes all those particular checks, then we can say that the supply chain or the distribution chain has been completed. And hence, MTS as a part of a strategy does not have all those perspectives, and hence there is a disconnect between the sales and production activity. Looking for an inventory, always the stores department and the manufacturing department should have a proper communication and coordination with respect to the availability of inventory and utilization of the inventory for a specified time period. So a proper control on inventory is essentially required for effective production activity that needs to be undertaken. Adjustments of the workload. So the workload with respect to the availability of the labor hours, the utilization of machine hours, the availability of material in the stores department, availability of raw material in the inventory that has been into process, all those activities are needed to be undertaken, and then accordingly the load of a particular machine or manufacturing activity is needed to be decided. Production can be undertaken only when sales are into existence. Unless and until there is no demand for a certain product, the selling or the supply activity cannot be undertaken. So, for an effective supply strategy is to be into existence, there should be a demand for a particular product. And when there is a supply for a particular product, equally there should be a demand for a product. And in a vice versa situation, when there is a demand for a particular product, there should be a supply for a product into the market. To conclude, the customer is always the king into the market, and here this particular theory applies to a certain concern that always whenever there is a demand for that has been created from the customer's end, it is a duty of the manufacturers to see that those particular products are being supplied into the market. And when the product is being supplied to the market, those particular demand is needed to be created by the consumers. MTS as a validity is a conceptual clarity and a different scenario from either ATO or from an MTO scenario, that is assemble to order or make to order. Making product as per the customer order is not a business and it is not a feasible solution. So the MTS as a part of a scenario is completely customer centric, and accordingly it focuses more on the need and demand of customers and not the production or the manufacturing activity. So in this case, the sustainability in the long run is very much effective and it is not possible. And hence, the decision that have been taken may go wrong, it may be hasty, and it may lead to the wastage of resources of the organization. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have learned What do we mean by MTS, that is make to order strategy? What are the various activities or the importance that has been there for the manufacturing unit as a part of an implementation of an MTS? And what is the emphasis or activities that are being performed under the MTS as a part of a strategy? I hope you must have enjoyed learning at this particular session. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.